All right. Well, once again, we are here for an evening of wildlife webinar, where we're going to be talking about an interesting topic. And today's topic is going to be about wildlife disease. Oftentimes, we talk about really cool, fun, exciting stuff, but you can't get a dose of reality if you're only talking about the positives, the good things. And hopefully everyone knows that there's a lot of things that occur out in nature that aren't so pleasant. One of those things is wildlife disease. And it's a completely natural process, completely natural event that occurs, and it affects a whole slew of wildlife. In fact, pretty much all species of wildlife are usually impacted by a multitude of diseases. However, of late, there's a couple of diseases that are really making the headlines, one more so than the other. But what we're going to do is we're going to talk about two specific diseases tonight. And the first one's going to be about white nose syndrome, which is a disease that impacts bats. And the second one is going to be chronic wasting disease. That's the one that's really making the headlines of late. And that one pretty much impacts deer. And so what we have three instructors for tonight: myself, Daryl Radijak, Robert Brewer, and Logan Barber. And to get things started here, what I want to do is just give everyone an idea of who is your instructor. And so, putting out a little bit of background information, I'll ask each one of our instructors to give a little background info. I'll start. Again, my name's Daryl Radijak. I am a wildlife biologist. I received my degree in environmental and forest biology from this really long-named college. It's the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry. If you haven't heard of it, it is part of the Syracuse University campus. Fantastic school for wildlife, fantastic school for forestry. But I got my degree way back when, early 1990s, when the bachelor's degree was really good enough for you to get a good job in whatever field you chose. Not so much anymore. Nowadays, people are getting their masters and even their PhDs just to get jobs. Anyway, I started working. One of my first wildlife jobs was working for the Appalachian Bear Center. I was the first curator / manager of the Appalachian Bear Center. Started working with bears, fell in love with bears on that side of things. But I soon jumped from that position to working for the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency. I was the big game program coordinator, which meant I was managing the bear, the deer, the elk, the wild hog, all those big game species in the state of Tennessee. I did that for about 7 years, and then I was promoted to chief of wildlife for the state of Tennessee. So suddenly I was over all of the wildlife. Obviously, we had a slew of biologists that did all the work, and I just had to deal with the politics of things. But the cool thing in that position, I dealt with everything, and white nose syndrome was definitely something I dealt with in bats. Also, chronic wasting disease I dealt with as the deer coordinator. About 3 years ago, I moved out to New Mexico, and that's where I currently reside. But enough about me. I've got quite a bit of experience. So, Robert, if you want to introduce yourself and give your background info.
Okay, Robert Brewer. I'm in Knoxville, Tennessee. Been here all my life. Got my bachelor's and master's both from University of Tennessee. Kind of weird route about it. Went to Eastern Kentucky in the meantime too. I've worked with pretty much everything that you can name except for bats. Primarily though with game animals and with environmental toxicology. I'm now coordinator of the Greg A. Vidal Center for Natural Resources and Conservation at Cleveland State Community College. And I've been at Cleveland State for about 16 years now and started their wildlife program there.
All right, Logan, how about you?
Got my bachelor's from the University of Tennessee in Knoxville in about 2012. Since then, I've taken a bunch of seasonal positions and short-term jobs all throughout the Southeast. I've worked for the Kentucky Fish and Wildlife Department. I've worked for volunteered for the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency. I've worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, doing all sorts of different things. Currently, I've ended up as a contractor employed through TVA as an environmental compliance terrestrial zoologist. So I basically look at and monitor any impacts to natural lands or threatened and endangered species that could possibly come from TVA actions.
And Logan is one that can attest getting a job in the field nowadays is extremely, extremely difficult. You've got to have quite a few connections and quite a bit of luck. But Logan's fantastic because he works quite a bit with the bats, and he helped with the snake presentation last week. So appreciate both Logan and Robert joining in today to hopefully answer any questions you may have. So what we're going to do now is we're going to get started, and before we jump into talking about these two specific diseases, I do want to tell you that wildlife management, wildlife sciences is a science, and it's not just a bunch of people coming up with opinions and promoting their opinions. There is literally a method that you have to go through. It's a scientific method in order for new information to become fact. And so what the scientific method involves, first off, you start with an investigation. There's a question about, in our case, there's a question about wildlife that you make an observation you don't know the answer to. And so pretty soon, if you want to pursue that, you start doing some experimentation. You form a hypothesis, and then what you're going to do is you're going to test that hypothesis. You're going to collect and analyze data to make sure what your observation holds true, or you might find out it doesn't hold true. And so what you're going to do is you're going to draw a conclusion. Here's a key part of science. Once you're all done, pretty much you have this information, you've done all the work, you've developed this hypothesis, you tested it, you got to get that information published in peer-reviewed publications. Now, we're not talking Better Homes and Garden, we're not talking hunting magazine, we're not talking these magazines that you buy on the grocery store shelf. We're talking peer-reviewed publications like the Journal of Wildlife Management, Science. What these are is, when we say peer-reviewed, other biologists, other scientists, they're on the editorial committee making sure what you've done has really followed a rigorous routine of testing your observation and your hypothesis. And so getting it published in those peer-reviewed publications is a really important step for this whole scientific method, because this is what we base the foundations of science on, literally. And I will tell you, Google is loaded with a lot of non-scientific information. A lot of people use Google. I use Google all the time because you can find some really good stuff out there, but you could also find quite a bit of really bad stuff out there. And so the unfortunate thing with Google, there's no peer review. Anyone can get up there, make a claim to whatever, and now it's published, and people read lots and lots of things on Google that is not scientifically correct. So just a warning there. So having said that, what we're going to do today, and what Wildlife for You is based all about, is making sure that we are bringing you the best, the most up-to-date, the most current science regarding the wildlife topics that we're talking to you about. And so what I'm going to do, we're going to talk about this first disease called white-nosed syndrome. And just so you know, you can get on the internet and you can find a lot of information. Where we have drawn quite a bit of this information, and again, it's science-based information. There's a group out there called the White-Nose Syndrome Response Team, and what it consists of, it's a conglomeration of state agencies, federal agencies, universities, private entities, but it's, like I said, it's this conglomeration of scientists that are looking at and researching and publishing and doing all the grunt work for finding out more about this white-nose syndrome disease. If you want to look them up on the website, it's www.whitenosesyndrome.org. Fantastic resource for learning everything you need to know about this unfortunate disease. So let's talk a little bit about white-nose syndrome. First off, white-nose syndrome is a disease that affects bats, pretty much hibernating bats. That's a key thing here, because there are some species that don't get impacted by this disease, but for bats that hibernate, it's a really, really bad disease. The thing with white-nose syndrome, the causal agent The thing that causes this disease that kills bats is this fungus. The scientific name is this Pseudogymnoascus destructans. It used to be known as another name, but instead of me calling it that long scientific Linnaean name, we're just going to call it PD, the PD fungus. But this is the fungus that gets on the bats that causes the disease that is killing all these bats. Now, just understand this fungus tends to grow in these cold, dark, damp places, and that is why it's primarily a disease of hibernating bats. Hibernating bats, obviously, they're going to find these caves that they're going to be spending months on end in the wintertime, and oftentimes during the winter it might be cold, dark, damp places. So it's a perfect environment for this fungus to grow. And unfortunately, that fungus grows on the bat, and it ends up killing the bat. And one of the reasons why it kills the bat, and a lot of this is still under investigation, but literally when this fungus begins to grow on the bat, and you can see in the picture that white powdery stuff around the nose, that is the fungus that's growing on the bat. One of the side effects of this fungus growing on the bat is it causes the bat to wake up in the wintertime. Now, I've taught multiple classes on black bear hibernation. The thing with hibernation that you have to understand is it's extremely taxing on a body. And so you have to be in extremely good shape in order to survive 3, 4, 5 months of not eating. And so what happens is when this fungus begins growing on the bat is in the middle of its hibernation, and it wakes the bat up. And obviously most people know that bats tend to feed on insects, which you're not going to find many insects around during the wintertime. So when the bat wakes up, it may leave the cave or the hibernacula where it's staying in search of food. It's not going to find food. It's expending a lot of its energy, and it's weakening that bat more and more because this fungus is waking it up during the middle of its hibernation. The bad thing is, this is a pretty severe disease. It can lead to massive population decline. We're talking 90% die-off or more. Many of these caves that we're seeing this tremendous die-off up in the northeast, it has spread to the southeast. But it's pretty bad when that fungus gets into these caves. Those bats that are susceptible, we're experiencing an extremely high amount of die-off. So this is not good because everyone knows bats are extremely beneficial to the environment. So I will tell you that numerous state and federal agencies, we're always conducting bat studies. Now, I had the pleasure of working for the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency, and when I was there, I was actually conducting some of these white nose syndrome studies on bats. And so typically what we do, we would set up a mist net over the mouth of a cave, or a harp net is another form of a net where it just catches the bat, doesn't hurt them. They fall down, and then we'll grab the bat delicately, place it in a brown bag, and then the researchers will examine the bat. And this is one of those studies that I participated on. I think this is 2011 around. But what we do is we'll examine the bats. The bats that we catch coming out, we put a tag in them, and so we can identify them from year to year. But the main thing when you're looking for white nose syndrome on bats is you're examining the wing. And what I'll show here is this is a picture of a healthy bat wing. You can see it's pretty much uniform in color. There's no tears, there's no breaks, and this bat was completely free of this fungus. Now another bat we pulled out of the same cave, this is what its wings look like. You can see they're almost see-through. There's a lot of loss of the skin, and what they're doing is they're burning up through a lot of their fat reserves. And like I said, hibernation is a really difficult time for the bats, and so if that fungus is causing them to be awake, expending a lot of their fat reserves, oftentimes it ends up killing the bat. And unfortunately, like I said, you can see mass die-offs in a lot of these hibernacula. So a couple more things, and then we're gonna start opening it up for questions. You have to understand that white nose syndrome has already killed millions of bats. It was first found in the Northeast, but it's sweeping across the country. And you'll see a slide here in a second to show you its progression. Another thing is some species tend to get hit much harder than other species. For example, northern long-eared bats are extremely susceptible to white nose syndrome. Same with little brown bats. And in fact, I was reading a paper today that some models predict that the fact that little brown bats are getting struck so hard by this white nose syndrome, in the Northeast, they predict that within the next 20 years, it could completely wipe out little brown bats in the Northeast. Tricolored bats, another really common bat that is extremely susceptible to white nose syndrome. But on the good side, or on the flip side, there's actually some species that really don't develop clinical signs, or at least we haven't detected it yet. Virginia big-eared bat is one of those. They hibernate in the wintertime, but as far as we know, they don't develop the clinical signs from white nose syndrome. And Logan and I were discussing this before this class started. This PD, this fungus that grows on the bat, it says here is unknown to science until it hit the U.S. That's a little misleading. It was known. This fungus has been known to science, but it's been known to science in Europe. It went under a different name, Geomyces destructans. When this fungus was transported to North America, and this is a big thing about invasive species. This fungus is an invasive species. It was transported to North America, and this fungus has never been known to develop these clinical symptoms and kill bats in Europe, but North America it started killing bats. So that's what this means. It wasn't known to kill bats until it hit the U.S. So to give you an idea of how widespread this is, it was first detected in a cave near Albany, New York, Howe Caverns. In fact, when I was a little boy, I went there. But if you look at the map there, you see the little red dot in the state of New York. That's where it was first discovered. This is 2005. And what I'm going to do is show you the progression of how quickly this white nose syndrome moved across the landscape. And so this is 2007. These are all the places we were detecting this fungus and these bat mortalities. So you see is mostly throughout New York State, 2007. 2009, it started exploding up and down the coast, the east coast of North America, all throughout the Appalachians. You'd even see it being detected in Tennessee there. 2011, it's starting to spread throughout the Midwest. 2013, you're just seeing it all over the eastern half of the United States. Unfortunately, 2015, you make a big jump, and we've discovered it in the Pacific Northwest. 2017, you can just see it is spreading all over North America. And again, this is a devastating disease to these bats that use these hibernacula. And the most current map, this is the most up-to-date map there is. The only place that has been spared so far is that Southwest, California and some of those southwestern states. That doesn't mean we're protected. We just probably haven't detected it yet. What my hope is that it's related to some moisture there, and so hopefully with us having a really dry landscape here, we will be somewhat protected, but that might be a false hope. So with that, what can you do to combat white nose syndrome? First and foremost, we got to stop spreading it. It didn't spread from that small cave in New York to the Pacific Northwest because of a bat flying from New York to Washington. It spreads mostly through human use. So if you enter a cave, you can pick up this fungus on your feet, on your gloves, whatever, and then if you go into another cave at a faraway place, you can transport that fungus from one cave to another. There are tons of caving guidelines about how to clean your gear if you do like going in caves and crawling in caves. But the best thing you can do is be knowledgeable about the disease. Ask questions, find out more. If you hear people talking about the disease and they're saying the wrong things, correct them. I mention all the time in my wildlife webinars that knowledge is power, and the more you know about these issues, the better off we will be at combating that, and we'll have a much more knowledgeable public. So that's the presentation for white nose syndrome. Let's spend a little bit of time here answering whatever questions you have. So start asking away, and this is where I'm probably going to have Logan chime in
All right.
most
Yeah,
of the
one thing I was going to
responses
add on
here.
this,
So,
as far as following the caving
Logan, if you want to
guidelines,
take over,
I know a lot of
I'll
people enjoy
monitor the chat.
spelunking and recreational caving. If you do, please make sure to look up the decontamination protocols. They're pretty easy to find if you just Google white nose syndrome decontamination. You can pretty much find the links to official websites such as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, U.S. Forest Service, things of that nature. And generally what it would encompass is removing any clothes that was exposed to the air while in a cave or around a possibly infected animal, bagging those up, and then boiling those. I think it's 135-degree water for roughly, I'm going to say 30 minutes. I think I'm going a little bit over. It's changed recently. I can't remember if they've dropped the temperature or the time, but one of those has changed recently. But that's the main thing, is because this fungus does spread by spores. So the biggest thing is you could have it on you and not notice. If you look down, well, I don't have any fungus on me. I don't have anything, white or anything like that I picked up from the cave. It can be transported in the soil. It can just be spores from the air that have gotten into your clothes, into your headlamp. A lot of things like that are hard surfaced or not very permeable, you can actually soak or douse with alcohol that you would buy at any kind of like Walmart, CVS, or anything like that. You can soak it down in that out of a spray bottle, and it actually helps to decontaminate things. But that is one of the biggest things to do, is if you are a recreational caver, is definitely make sure you can do anything to bag up, boil, and then decontaminate any kind of gear that you have.
All right, Logan, do you know the answer to Sarah's question? She says she's a veterinarian. She wants to know if this is a lower respiratory infection or more of an upper respiratory.
Now, I could be wrong, but I know for the most part,
Do you know?
it is more of like skin lesions that appear that can compromise immune systems. That, like Daryl said, can cause scratching and itching, which then awakes the bat. And then to a point, if you've got a bunch of open sores from where you've been scratching up against rocks, scratching yourself, anything like that, you're more compromised to anything that could be coming in from the outer environment. And as far as it says, the European bats, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, the one thing. Well, I was just going to chime in. I do have on the side, in case we get a question that might be a little beyond our scope of expertise, the white nose syndrome, that website, I have it up here, and one of the ways to detect you're looking at the skin underneath the microscope, and so it's
as far
like
as
Logan
the
said, it's
European
definitely
bats
more
that
of
are
a
resistant,
skin
I
element,
think the prevailing
more
theory
so
from
than
everything I've heard at
a
every
respiratory
meeting
element.
and from all the literature I've read is that the fungus over there pretty much evolved with the bats, so that most of the genetic lines that have made it on that side of the world, they made it by overcoming white nose, which is something that it is a curiosity if that would ever happen to the North American bats or not. Like, will we hit an immediate, low that will then eventually starts building itself back up, or will we hit the low and just keep digging and possibly lose species? And I think when you look at something that could have evolved with the species of bats over there for several millennia, they didn't have the difference in habitat loss and other problems that our bats in North America are facing currently. There are a couple of studies that are looking at that.
Okay,
from
Summer
what I've
asked
seen
the
and
question,
from
can they
people I've
spray the
talked to
caves
from
with
the meetings.
antifungals
There's a
during
bunch of different things. Some of
non-hibernating
them are coming
months?
from shellfish exoskeletons. Some are coming from pineapples, if I remember right. The issue is that most of this stuff isn't being done just in a completely controlled environment. So anything that they're looking at spraying in there to possibly help the bats that could kill the white nose in the cave, we have to make sure that there's no impacts or effects to any kind of threatened or endangered microorganisms such as insects, maybe even salamander populations. There's a lot of different cave fish, things of that nature. If there's aquatic systems within caves, all of those could be potentially affected. So trying to figure out every effect and to make sure that we're helping the bats and not hurting something else equally as much has caused a lot of studies to take a whole lot of time. Right now, I think one of the last things that I've heard about it, I believe it was chitosan. It was the one made of shellfish exoskeleton, if I remember right. They have actually seen that there are decreases in white nose and PD on bats. It's actually killing the fungus. However, they haven't actually shown a lower mortality of the bat. So while they are killing the fungus, they don't know why it is still causing the bats to die. And it could be that it's irritating the bats just as much. It could be that once the bats already have lesions and things like that, they stay from deep hibernation, more of in a torpor type state, and still aroused throughout the winter. But those are questions right now that people are still kind of looking at.
While you read some of the other questions there, Logan, I'm going to chime in about what can be done. And I sit in on a couple of different bat working groups, and there is a ton of research currently being conducted literally all over North America. And I think Logan mentioned pineapples. I do know there's one study I recall that was looking at a chemical that was in bananas. And so they are really trying to find a cure for this. But one of the hardest things is the application. And like Logan said, that you have to be concerned about what other side effects you might have. But I will tell you, when I was back in Tennessee, the Nature Conservancy was doing a study. There was a gray bat hibernacula. Gray bats are an endangered species in Tennessee, and there was a large hibernacula north of Nashville. And the Nature Conservancy invested literally $100,000 to construct an artificial cave in hopes that those bats would go into the artificial cave, and then they could clean that artificial cave and remove all the fungus from it. Unfortunately, they didn't have much success of getting the bats to move over to the artificial cave. And so all was not for naught. They're still doing a ton of research in that area, but there are just numerous organizations and state and federal agencies that are researching cures for white nose syndrome.
Organizations like the Nature Conservancy, TVA's actually partner with them, so some of the people from our department actually go out and we help with money and just with blood, sweat, and tears putting up cave gates, and this helps in keeping a lot of unwanted traffic out in some caves. We've done this on, I think, at least I go to at least 4 for TVA that are gated off and closed to the public, and most of those are because we know it is a large hibernacula for either gray bats, or there are historical records of Indiana or northern long-eared bats that use it. So the cave gates are something that, while not very popular with a lot of the public, it is good for the species. Another question was, would it be possible to bring this home to pets? I don't believe any cats, dogs, or anything like that out of the Chiroptera area are affected by white nose.
And Janice, you asked a question about this type of fungus seemed to be related to other fungus they've seen. It had to start somewhere and maybe change over time. And what Logan was describing, in Europe where this fungus originated, you have to understand this fungus started eons ago. Who knows how many years ago? But as this fungus was developing, the wildlife there, the bats that were in Europe, were also present at the time. So it's this fact that these native animals in Europe were evolving with that fungus, and they developed this more or less immunity to this fungus, so they're not getting impacted by the fungus. Now, when you take a species and you move it to a completely foreign area, or you introduce it to a new area, those animals that are around there have never seen this kind of fungus before, and their body will react differently. And so it's this process of evolving in one particular location with all the different species, from wildlife to fungus to bacteria. You develop immunities over time, but when something is introduced for the very first time into a new area, oftentimes that's when it wreaks the most havoc. And that's what's happening in North America.
As we do go around the valley and monitor populations through emergent counts, and then we also partner with multiple universities as far as doing swabs and studies of bats in caves and their hibernacula. So we've taken multiple swabs and sent it off for all sorts of different protocols, seeing if white nose is being detected, and then providing samples that could be used to possibly be used to be treated. So using things like the pineapple extract, the shellfish extract, things of that nature. And there is one thing that has seemed pretty hopeful, is that gray bats, like Daryl said, are one of the federally endangered bats that happen in our area. And seems to be a potential organism on their microbiome that doesn't allow for much growth of the PD. And that is something that they have been looking at. I believe it's Dr. Donald Walker at MTSU, I think is where he's at now. And they are looking at trying to propagate that organism or that chemical off the microbiome and try to find a way to apply it to different bats. And the hope there would be that since gray bats are so common and that there are so numerous in many of the caves, that if it's on them already, that it might not be something as harmful to other organisms in the cave if it was sprayed or added in. Hibernacle.
Okay, well, let's answer that last question from Lori, and then we're going to move on to our next disease.
Large rock shelters, things of that
Logan,
nature.
you want to answer that?
Just where the bats spend the winter.
And please, please call us out. We are biologists, and it's one of my biggest pet peeves is we use terminology that is common in our vernacular when we're talking to other biologists, but oftentimes we don't realize the words we say might not be understood. So if there's anything we say tonight
just as anybody
that
is.
you don't understand, by all means stop us and say, what did you just say? So thanks for calling us out on that, Lori. My bad. Okay, we're switching gears to this new disease, this chronic wasting disease. Now, I am sure, in fact, I'm not even going to ask the question to the group. Many people have probably heard of this zombie deer disease. The news stations, the radio, the media, the television, they love hyping things up. Headlines sell newspapers, headlines get people to watch TV and click on things. And so they have labeled this new disease, it's not a really new disease, but this up-and-coming disease, the zombie deer disease. That is not the case. The disease is called chronic wasting disease, but what we want to do, I'm going to do a couple more slides just to talk about the biology of chronic wasting disease. But just like the whole the white-nosed bat website that's state and federal agencies, there is a conglomeration of state, federal, universities, colleges, universities, private entities, some of these non-government organizations that are researching chronic wasting disease. And their website is this cwd-info.org. It's literally called the CWD Alliance. But like I said, it consists of all these state, federal agencies, universities, all these groups doing scientific research. This is not opinion-based. This is the leading information. Now, I will tell you, the thing with science is, it too is always evolving. So we will learn something, and then a few years down the road, we'll improve on what we have learned. And sometimes we modify things that may have been said in the past. So science is constantly evolving because we're constantly testing these new hypotheses and new theories. And so most of the information that we are presenting here on chronic wasting disease is coming from this website, which is the best up-to-date scientific information on CWD. So, first and foremost, CWD, I'm going to call it CWD from here on out. CWD affects cervids, and this is one of those fancy words that biologists throw out. Literally what we mean when we are talking about cervids, it's the deer family. And so this includes white-tailed deer, mule deer, elk, moose. Any of those members of the deer family can be susceptible to CWD. I think reindeer as well. What we're going to be talking here, and this is where I'm going to get a little bit technical, but just bear with me. Sit back and try to absorb this and see if it makes more sense after the way I explain it. But what CWD is, what chronic wasting disease is, it's this family of diseases known as this transmissible spongiform encephalopathy. It's abbreviated TSE. Now, it's a close group of diseases that are caused by this one causal agent, and I'll explain that in a second. But it includes a number of other diseases. So CWD is in the same family of diseases as, has anyone ever heard of mad cow disease? Mad cow disease is a BSE, is a bovine spongiform encephalopathy. So mad cow disease is in the same family of diseases as chronic wasting disease. There is a human form of this that is called Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, CJD. Very terrible disease for humans to get. It's always fatal. The thing with these diseases is it's still an emerging science where they're still learning quite a bit. There's still a lot they don't know. But these are all in the same family of transmissible spongiform encephalopathies. I'm going to explain what that is. What it means, these diseases are all caused by a prion. And I promise not to get too technical, but I think when you sit down and close your eyes and think about it, you'll begin to understand. What is happening within the body? Our bodies and animal bodies, we use proteins. Proteins are a good thing, and we have to take in proteins, and our cells are always using these proteins. What a prion is, or a prion, however you pronounce it, I usually say prion. What this prion is a misfolded protein. So here it is, our cells need protein, and along comes this protein that is bent, it's folded the wrong way. So our body goes from this very useful item in this protein to this misformed or misfolded protein that the body can't use anymore. Now keep in mind, this protein's not alive. It's not a virus. It's not a bacteria. It's this protein that's on the outside of the cell. Because it's misfolded, the body doesn't recognize it. Now it will replicate it, but it can't use it. So this protein begins building up within certain tissues, primarily the spinal column and in the brain. What happens is, because it keeps getting replicated and keeps building up inside the body, because the cells can't use it, it begins piercing a lot of the cells, and it causes perforations in the brain. Now this takes a long, long time. This is not something where you get this prion introduced into your body and within a matter of days you die. It's a long-acting disease. Most of the time it takes years to develop. Now, because the body's not able to use this misfolded protein or this prion, perforations, think of like, someone described it to me one time, think of your brain getting 1,000 microscopic knife cuts in it. And over time, that damages your brain. And so your brain slowly over time becomes perforated. And the symptoms of this disease, and the best way to describe it is in human terms, it's very analogous to someone having Alzheimer's or dementia, where suddenly people start losing their faculties. They forget where they're at. They don't know what's going on. And so this is a very debilitating disease in the later stages. And so this chronic wasting disease, again, it's in the same family of diseases as this, the mad cow disease and that Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. Like I said, it's not a fast-acting disease. You don't pick up the deer doesn't pick up this prion and then within a few days it dies. This may take years to develop. Here's the thing. This disease, chronic wasting disease, CWD, is always fatal. If you introduce the disease into a deer in a pen and you continue feeding that deer will die from CWD. It might take a few years, but it's going to die from that disease. Its brain will become so spongified, its brain will deteriorate so much that it will kill the deer from that disease. The problem is, deer don't often die from the disease itself. Now, the disease will cause the deer to die, but like I was saying, it's very much like Alzheimer's. Imagine if you're a deer and you're still well enough to be out there eating, but you kind of lose your senses about you. Oftentimes, these deer that are infected with chronic wasting disease, they more oftentimes get struck by car than a healthy deer. They get preyed upon more often than healthy deer. In fact, that's been quite a bit of the research of late that shows in these areas where chronic wasting disease is prevalent, the deer that cougars and some of these other large predators are eating, there's a bias towards them being able to target and kill and capture these CWD infected deer. And so a lot of times people will look at that and say, well, the deer didn't die of CWD. No, it was killed by something else, but if it didn't have the disease, odds are it probably wouldn't have died prematurely. And that's why CWD-related mortality is hard to see. Because even though the deer is destined to die when it picks up this chronic wasting disease, oftentimes it dies before it gets to that advanced stages. Because, again, think of that dementia. Think of this animal losing its faculties and not being able to function properly. Now, this is where it gets scary. And when we start talking about CWD, this is why all those alarm bells are going off. Because chronic wasting disease is caused by this misfolded protein, it's not alive. It's not like a virus. It's not like a fungus. So you can't really kill it or it doesn't die out. And so if you look at some of these other diseases that impact deer, there's this disease called epizootic hemorrhagic disease. It's a virus that's transmitted by this little biting midge. And when a deer herd gets infected with EHD, those deer can die really quickly, literally within a matter of days or a few weeks. As soon as they develop that virus, they can pass out, or they can die from that virus. It's fast acting. But the fact that it's a virus, that virus, once it runs its course, it will disappear from that population. Odds are that it will come back over time, but once that virus dies out for that year, you're gonna last a long time without any impacts from that virus typically. Same thing with there's another ailment that hits deer called brainworm, or meningeal worm is another term for it, caused by this little tiny worm called P. tenuis. But it's very similar in that it affects the brain. The deer doesn't know how to act properly. But the fact of the matter is, those things, whether or not it's a virus, if it's a bacteria, if it's a worm, those things can be killed out and that disease could be wiped away, or it could disappear for a long period of time. Not so much with chronic wasting disease. Remember that protein is not alive. And so therefore these prions, these misfolded proteins, they can remain viable in the soil for years. So you have an infected deer. For example, if the deer in this picture carried chronic wasting disease, and so it has these prions, it has these disease-causing agents in its brain, in its spinal column, that deer, when the carcass rots away on the landscape, those prions are still there. There's actually been studies that say that those prions will go down into the soil, and plants can take those prions up in their tissues. And so another deer can come on by and become infected simply because it was feeding in an area where that previously infected deer had died. And so that's what makes this thing so scary. And here's where it becomes an issue. Now remember, this is a long-acting disease. The deer might take a few years to develop the symptoms, the clinical symptoms, before it dies of the disease. And so you could have CWD in a population, especially when you first start getting the disease into your area. You could have that disease in your population. You don't notice any impacts. It's because the deer, it's manifesting within that herd. It's growing. It tends to take out those older deer because it takes so long to manifest. But once you have 27% prevalence, and let me describe what prevalence is. Prevalence, the simple way of thinking about it is what percentage of the population is infected. So whenever you have 27% of the population or higher, you begin to start to see these population decreases. And so in the very beginning, when the disease is out there and only maybe 2% or 5% of the population have it, you don't see much impact because, again, it takes a long time to manifest. But as soon as that disease starts to spread and gets up over 27%, that's the latest science, that is when you start to see these population level decreases. And again, the scary thing is we'll never get rid of this. It's not something that's going to die out over time. What's scary, and I shouldn't say scary, but what we have seen in some of these herds where CWD has been detected literally for a few decades, that prevalence, that percentage of the herd that is infected continues to grow and grow and grow and grow. And some of these unmanaged herds where the disease is just spreading at its own pace, you're seeing up to 40% of that deer herd carrying this disease. And how that could ever be rectified, this is why it's causing such a stir in the scientific community, is they don't know what they're going to do. There's no getting rid of this disease. And so as it stands right now, there's no cures, no vaccines for these prion diseases. And so that goes far beyond just chronic wasting disease. That bovine, the mad cow disease, that Creutzfeldt-Jakob, these prion disease, these transmissible spongiform encephalopathies, there's no cure for them. And this is what makes them scary. I hate that they label it zombie disease, but it's a scare tactic that's put on by a lot of these news agencies. But that does not mean it's nothing to worry about. It's definitely something that is going to be impacting most states in North America. Now, I don't have the progression. I should have did it. I should have done the progression of CWD across the landscape. It was first talked about in Colorado back in the 70s. There was a lab there in Colorado that described it, and for the most part, it stayed in the West. It stayed Colorado, Wyoming, a little bit of Montana, and then for literally decades and decades. And then the scary thing is, 2001, it made a big jump. It showed up in a deer in Wisconsin. And so it started spreading to these eastern states. Most of you know the eastern half of the United States is chock full of white-tailed deer. And so as soon as it emerged in 2001, in fact, I attended a chronic wasting disease conference in 2005. We were concerned about it then. When it made that big jump across the Mississippi River, we knew that we're in store for something really bad. And we've been studying this disease for about 20 years. We're learning more and more and more, but there's still a lot we don't know about this disease. So the one thing that is unfortunate when it comes to chronic wasting disease is, for some reason or another, there's a lot of misinformation being spread about the disease. You will hear people talk about it's not a big deal, nothing to see. That's pretty much because of the way I described it. When it first comes into an area, the prevalence rate is really low. There's only a small percentage of the population that is carrying this disease. And because it takes so long to manifest, usually you're not going to see a difference for quite some time. But unfortunately, as decades go by, you're going to start to see those population level decreases. So you have some people that are saying, oh, it's not a big deal. They're blowing it way out of proportion. Nothing to see here. For those that don't know, that's Frank Drebin. That was one of the best movies of all time. A lot of people you'll hear talking about it's a government conspiracy.
Yeah, I can't hear him either. Let me give him a call on the phone, make sure he didn't drop out
You're
of the
locked
internet
up on
service.
me, Daryl.
Hold on just a second, y'all.
Okay. While we're waiting on him to get back, I'll answer a couple of questions that have come up in the thing here. Well, they jumped to the bottom. Let's see here. Jim, it says is what I'm hearing you say is CW is trans species in the idea that yes, many species of deer are affected. Thus far, CWD is confined to the deer family, even though it has been shown in white-tailed deer, mule deer, elk, caribou, um, moose. They're in the deer family, but it is multiple species within there. Shirley said, "Will it eventually wipe out the deer population altogether?" Well, no, not really. It will dramatically change the populations as we know them, particularly the age structure, since it is such a slow forming disease and takes so long to uh, manifest in the deer. You will still have reproduction. You will still have deer on the landscape, but you won't have the same population age structure. You won't have as many deer as you had. And Shirley, any idea how it showed up in Wisconsin? Several ideas, and we'll get to more of them in a minute. That's a long, lengthy question or answer.
I'll answer the one from Lori that's right below it while you're reading that one. Right now, there's no evidence of CWD spreading to humans.
I'm reading Sarah's other
but
question.
like any kind of diseased animal, it's not recommended that you eat any of the meat if you suspect the animal to have the disease. So if you see signs of it or are unsure, it's best to stay away from it.
Um, and I'm gonna go back to Sarah. Sarah, I don't know what part of the state you are in. Thus far in Tennessee, CWD has only been detected in the southwestern portion of the state, a little bit east of Memphis. We had 186 cases reported last year. There are no cases reported anywhere else. Um, and that could be any number of things with that deer, but it depends what part of the state you're in. If you tell me what part you're in Wilson County, I don't know that any cases have been reported in Wilson County. That you would be north of the area that's affected. That doesn't mean that it's not there. Now, Sandy, you say, is this an actual disease or a mutation causing problems? Well, a disease by definition is anything that causes harm to the organism. So, yes and no. It is a disease, chronic wasting disease. It's not a mutation per se, even though there are types of this disease that result from mutations, and we'll get into them a little bit in a little while. This is a protein, a misshaped protein that's being transmitted from one animal to the next that causes the disease we call chronic wasting disease. And Sarah, no, cooking venison will not inactivate or break down the proteins unless you can get them up there around 1200 degrees. In other words, you have to incinerate it to break down those proteins. And okay, Darryl, I'm going to answer one more question and we'll let you have it back. Laurie says, is this something that's passed from does to their fawns? Okay. What we know about transmission from parents to offspring comes from scrapie, another spongiform encephalopathy that's known from sheep, and it's been known since 1732. This is not a new group of diseases or disease-causing pathogens. In their studies, they found that no, it is not passed through the reproductive system, and they looked at it because of embryo transfer and artificial insemination in sheep for breeding purposes.
Yeah.
And they found that it was very.
Yeah, let me finish my. I'm almost done, and then we'll make sure we touch on everyone's slides.
Right,
I apologize. Just so you know, I have done, I think, like 62, 64 webinars, and I've always dreaded. I knew the day was coming when my connection would get lost, and for some reason I lost connection. But I'm so thankful Robert and Logan were here. We'll come back to the questions in just a second. I think I'm almost done with the slides here. Just so you know, we're not doing it for the money. People will say that the government invented chronic wasting disease to get grant money, but it's utter nonsense, so don't believe that. But here's the thing. Why is there so much information about this particular disease? You don't see a ton of misinformation being falsely spread about white nose syndrome or any of these other wildlife diseases. You have to understand how important deer are to our society. And so most people know that deer provide hunting opportunities, and there's millions and millions and millions of hunters out there that love going after deer. And when your pastime, your passion, something you love to do is threatened and it's unknown what's going to happen with this, you're going to you're going to seek any type of alternative to to find some kind of comfort in what this thing is not as bad as what people are saying. And so nobody wants to hear that their livelihood or lifestyle is threatened. And so oftentimes they're latching on to some of these straws, they're grasping for straws, trying to understand CWD, and there's a lot of misinformation that's being spread. Remember, I said Google is great, but Google has a lot of bad information, and unfortunately, chronic wasting disease is one of those diseases that a lot of misinformation is spread. And so, what can you do to combat chronic wasting disease? Again, follow regulations provided by wildlife agencies. There's now, I forget the number, and correct me if I'm wrong, Logan or Robert, but it's like 26 states. It used to be just a couple, but over the last 2 decades, it's grown to 26 states that now have chronic wasting disease. Each one of those is monitored, is regulated. A lot of information is provided by the state wildlife agency. Follow what they're saying, read what they're saying, ask them questions. They employ the biologists that are in the know on how best to deal with these diseases. And again, be knowledgeable. Seek some answers, but make sure where you're asking these questions and where you're getting these answers from, make sure it's a reputable source that is based on science. So with that, let's go to all the questions. I know there's a lot of questions on CWD. So I don't know what has been answered or not. So Robert, if you want to chime in on what we've answered so far, or just tackle any of these questions. Oh, regarding the, okay.
Yeah, I'm looking phone number up for Sarah right now. Um,
Now,
Nashville. Yeah, said she hasn't
I
gotten in
will
touch
tell
with
you,
anybody with
it has not been
TWRA.
detected in the Nashville
Um,
area, but when it comes to some of those neurological problems,
with
there's
a
a number
deer
of things
with
that can cause
what you
that.
consider
What
neurological
I found
problems.
when I
What's
was a
that?
deer coordinator for the state of Tennessee, oftentimes when you see a deer kind of listless or just wandering around or walking in circles, it was one of two things. One thing that was usually the main cause was getting struck by a vehicle. Oftentimes they'll have internal injuries, but especially if they have a head injury, anything that's impacting the brain is going to cause that deer to lose its faculties. But another big one, it wouldn't be present right about now. It's usually more in the wintertime, is what are called brain abscesses. Most of you know that white-tailed deer, the bucks, the male deer will fight and they'll bang their heads together and clash their antlers. And every so often, it will cause a fracture in their skull or a hole in their skull, and that becomes infected. And then obviously the brain is impacted. So these brain abscesses cause these neurological diseases or neurological signs. Same thing with that meningeal worm. Hopefully, Sarah, it's not CWD in the Nashville area, but it's always best to contact the State Wildlife Agency.
Okay. I'm gonna come back to one that's a little higher, but I'm gonna get Mark's first. Says he has a farm in Hardin County, one over from where CWD is found in Tennessee, and shoot, need a lot of deer. What do we do? How do we make good decisions? Should we have every deer shot, tested, not eat till we get the results back? Well, as Logan pointed out, there have not been any documented cases of CWD being transmitted to a human. If you want to play it safe, there are ways to have the meat tested, and from what I understand, it's about a 2 week turnaround time to get the meat tested. If you process your own, it's no big deal. You process it, wait the 2 weeks, get your results back. If you're paying somebody to process it for you, that may influence your decision a little bit. Honestly, I eat a lot of deer meat myself. If it ever makes it to East Tennessee or the areas where I deer hunt, I will have every deer tested before I eat it. Because I not only eat it myself, I feed it to a lot of people. We have a food bank, feed it to friends and neighbors, give a lot away, and I'm not going to give away something that could be harmful, even though it hasn't been yet. Now I'm going to go back up just a little while, just a little bit here, and I'm going to get this big
Robert, while you're looking for that, I was
elephant in
going
the
to add
room
on to what you
question that
said
somebody
to
asked me
Mark.
here.
I hunt and have a hunt and lease in Benton County,
Where'd
Tennessee,
it
and even
go?
though we're outside of the CWD known range, that is something that I've decided on, along with the lease members this year, that we're going to start having the deer tested just as an in case, because with my luck, it's best to play it as safe as possible.
Okay, I'm going to go back to Shirley's question. And any idea how it showed up in Wisconsin? And this is me talking. This is from a lot of research that I've done. And you could ask that same question about how did it show up
Norway.
X, Y, and Z. And there are several ways that this has been spread. Now, keep in mind, this has also been found in Korea. And if I'm not mistaken, it's either Finland or Norway in reindeer. Couple of ways it can be spread. One, moving live animals. There is a large deer farming industry out there. Live animals for a long time were moved from one farm to the other. And oftentimes there's a very strong tie to captive deer facilities as to where this is found in the wild. Another way that it can be transmitted or be moved is if somebody brought back an infected animal with them and they disposed of the carcass in the area. That's a possibility as well. So, and there are other ways that it can be passed as well. Daryl mentioned that this is a neurological disorder. It's very strongly tied to the nervous system. It's also very strongly tied to the lymphatic system. We test lymph nodes for the disease. And it's very strongly tied to the alimentary canal, which means the digestive system. It can be passed in saliva, urine, feces, things like that. And we bottle and ship deer urine all over the country every year.
The scary thing with its
how did it get there? We
transmission
can't say
into
for
new
sure.
places,
Are there multiple
it's
routes
just
that can
compounding.
be used to
It's
get
getting
there?
exponential.
Yes.
When
And that's
this
just a few of
disease
the
was
ones that
primarily
I gave you right
located
there.
in those western states of Colorado, Wyoming, it stayed there for literally a few decades. But then when it was transported somewhere, we don't know how, there's no definitive smoking gun, and it shows up, it just means there's more potential places for it to be picked up in. And so we have seen kind of this exponential growth within the last 5 or 6 years of states in the East Coast. Tennessee was the most recent, Mississippi. I hate to say this, but this is not going to be a possibility for states to stay disease-free. It's going to come to their state before long, and it's going to literally come down to a case of disease management.
I wanted to add in on top of what Robert said. There is some studies in the scientific literature that do show that, like Daryl said, these animals can be preyed upon more heavily than non-infected animals. And it has been shown that some of these prions can pass through the digestive systems of some predator species that can then redeposit them on the landscape at a later date. So if you have a far-ranging predator species, it is possible, while not necessarily overly likely, that they can deposit that predator can deposit it in its scat or urine later on after it's moved away from a kill.
Rob, which questions are you answering?
Yes, Shirley, under the last two. Yes and yes. Okay.
Oh, yeah, and
She said
the thing
possibly
is,
hunting in the
just
west to
so
bring
folks
back the
know,
entire
when we were
animal,
talking
yes,
about
that would be one way to bring it back.
an infected
Take
deer,
it into an
if
area,
a
and then
hunter
she said
goes
coyotes on the
elsewhere,
scat, and I said yes, that would be another
there
way to
are
bring it back.
regulations that states have put in place, literally all over North America, that says you cannot transport that deer's head or spinal column. You have to debone the meat. You have to make sure there's no brain material for you to transport that deer back to your state. So there's regulations put in place to protect your state, but unfortunately, not everyone adheres to regulations. There's lawbreakers all the time, but it can be brought in through other means. Robert, you scared me when you answered yes to Shirley, because one of her questions was, will it eventually wipe out the deer population? Oh, you already did answer that one? Good.
Oh no, I answered
Yeah,
that
and
one.
as far as we know, think about it,
Yeah, I said it would change the
in the
population
term
structure and it
that
would change the
it
number
takes
of
so
deer on the
long to
landscape, but it
act
would
that
not
you
wipe them
lose
out because it's
those
such a
older
long-acting
deer.
disease.
Now, typically in a deer's lifespan, it can live up to be 5, 6, 7 years old. If a deer has CWD, it's not going to live that long. It may be dying earlier. So the fact that they could still breed and reproduce and produce more deer, there shouldn't be any cause for a population to be wiped out. You're just going to lower the population. All right. Are there any other questions either one of you want to tackle?
Yes. Well, Mark asked, is there a testing kit available? No, you can't test it yourself. What they do is called a Western blot. They actually take a slice of the tissue and they stain it and look at it. But you can have it sent to several places. If you just do, and I assume, are you in Tennessee, Mark? I don't know. But no matter where you are, if you do a quick Google search of CWD testing Tennessee, it'll take you to the TWRA CWD page, and on there it has a link for testing uh, deer outside the CWD unit, and there are places in Colorado, Florida, Kansas, Missouri, Pennsylvania, Texas, Utah, and Wisconsin that all
Okay.
do
Can
tests,
I answer Gil's
and you can
question?
send the tissues to them.
Um,
They have
Gil
contact
asked the
information
questions
there
of,
for you.
speaking of
Tells you what to
regulations, why are
send,
many
how
of
to send
them
it, and things along
trying to
those lines.
get hunters to kill more deer? If it can't be stopped, how does that help?
Yes.
And this is one of those misunderstood regulations, because oftentimes what state wildlife agencies are doing is they're trying to slow the spread of CWD. And in fact, let me go back to a couple of slides. One of the things, uh, if you look at the very bottom of this slide here, strategies to slow the spread is the current BMP, and I apologize for the acronym. That's the best management practice. And so if you have a non-infected deer herd, and suddenly that prion, that disease agent, is introduced into a deer herd, it's going to begin spreading. If you have a lot of deer in an area, you have high deer density, that disease will spread faster. And so, like Robert said, it could be spread through saliva, through blood, through urine, through also rotting carcass, all sorts of means. And when you have more deer on the landscape, it could go from one deer to the next deer to the next deer much more rapidly than if your deer density is extremely low. So a lot of people misunderstand what the state wildlife agencies are trying to do. They're not trying to kill a deer to prevent a deer from becoming sick. They're trying to reduce they're trying to reduce the deer herd so it doesn't spread as fast across the landscape. And so that's simply why they do that. Oh, good. I'm glad you knew that answer, because there's a lot of folks that don't know that answer. But I appreciate you asking that. Actually, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to ask a question to Logan and Robert, and hopefully this will spur some talk. But recently, within the last 6 months, there was some news especially coming out of Pennsylvania, that chronic wasting disease was caused by a virus, and there will be a cure within a year. Logan, can you comment on that?
Yeah, I'm going to try to keep it short and sweet. Basically, there was a claim from a doctor out of LSU about this being caused by spiroplasma. This really interested me when it first came out, so I did a deep dive in all the literature that I could on it. Basically, his research ended up having a lot more questions to myself than it did answers. One of the particular study methods was to take infected material out of one animal, see if it had spiroplasmas in it, and then inject that into the brain of another animal. And if that animal showed up with CWD, it seemed to be that they were saying that it was because of the spiroplasma. I'm not sure, from what I'd read, if there was any kind of protocols that were making sure there was no prions present in that material, but that was the main basis of what he had found and what he was trying to build a case on. That research, if I'm wrong, Daryl, correct me, but I believe was over 10 years old. Multiple other researchers had tried to take a look at it, had tried to find the causative agent to be spiroplasma, and nobody else really could. And then to kind of counter those studies, one organization went in, I can't remember the university, but they actually artificially created prions and then could still make CWD happen in cervid species.
Thank you. And
I'll add to that. I saw that his news release as well, and there were a couple of red flags on it. Number one, it was being paid. He was being paid by a sportsman's group that did not like the way the state was managing the deer herd. And number two, he gave a list of what he would do with his cure. And number one was stop CWD in deer, and I think number three on the list was cure Alzheimer's in humans. And that threw a red flag up immediately for me, because if he had something that could do that, obviously the cure for Alzheimer's should come first. So I had a lot of problems with this study. I've read most of them. And like I said, it's been around a while. It's not been corroborated, and there were a lot of holes.
And I do think one thing to add, while I'm not
I
necessarily
really
trying to throw
sincerely,
stones or
truly
anything,
hope
but just to add
he's right.
information onto the
And it's
subject,
that simple.
is
I'm not
that
betting
he
the
has
house on it.
resigned from LSU after that press conference went viral. I do not know exactly why of the reason. I think he cited that LSU and he could not agree on patent monies and patent designs, which to me was a little bit of a red flag.
so, does anyone else have any other questions about chronic wasting disease? Let's go make sure we answered all the questions. Lori, you did.
I believe Lori had.
Who was that?
Lori had the one about
Yeah,
another
go ahead,
species,
Logan.
like bears. I was going to let you take that one since
Oh,
you're the bear
well,
guy.
it has been known. I was actually seeking your help. No, it has not been known to pass to bears, but isn't there like a feline version of this, Logan, if I'm not mistaken?
They have done it, yeah, in the literature. It is crossed in laboratory and closely observed
There is.
studies. They have made
There
it
is.
cross from individuals in feline species. Additionally, sheep's, goats, and I've even found evidence. This also comes from some of Bastian's research, the guy at LSU, that I think prions were also found in rabbits, if I'm not mistaken.
And
That
didn't one
that
study
has
actually
since been
induce
kind of pulled back.
not
That
really
caused quite a
CWD, but
scare
similar
because
prion disease in
um,
macaques by feeding them
the
CWD
fact of the matter
infected
is, if you give CWD to macaques obviously are a primate, which humans are a
Okay.
primate, and that caused quite a stir for a while. But Logan, if you want to comment on how that was not retracted, but kind of buried, so to speak.
It Yeah, it wasn't retracted. They actually presented at the Canadian Prion Symposium, if I remember right. I could be getting the name wrong there, but they did present it. I watched the study off of YouTube. I believe you could still probably find it if you look for it, and it seemed to be pretty viable, and it seemed to be right, and have good information to it. But overall, that just kind of disappeared. It got looked at, I think, by a National Health Institute. They did a similar study or even tested some of the same material from those same macaques and couldn't find it. And since then, from what I've seen in literature and in searches, is that study's just kind of disappeared. It didn't get proven false or nothing like that. It just kind of went away. And I don't know if that's because there ended up being a design flaw in the study or what it could possibly be. But that did cause a lot of alarm, but it seems like it's been put on the back burner for right now, which means that there's probably something false in the study.
Let me go back to something here that might help people understand a little bit. And you talked about other spongiform encephalopathies, and you talked about CJD in humans. we have to understand that there's two forms of CJD. There is a genetic form, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. You could be carrying a gene right now that at some point in your life, it will turn that gene on, you'll start making prions, and you will die of CJD. And then there's a variant CJD, which is an acquired form, which you can pick up from coming in contact with those prions. Variant CJD is known from a tribe in Papua New Guinea, and it was called Kuru, where in their culture they considered it to be a sign of respect to eat the brain of the person that had passed, and of course that was transmitting the disease. And in modern times, it was found primarily in morticians handling embalming bodies that had been of people that had died of CJD. This variant form is what people are worried about because it's the one you pick up. And so if this thing could ever jump the species barrier, that would be what it would be called. It would be called a variant CJD then. It wouldn't be called chronic wasting disease in humans or zombie disease in humans. But going to Gil's question there, we haven't found a cure since 1723 for scrapie. We don't have a cure for CJD in humans.
And I think I'll add to that because if you look at
genetic,
the scrapie monitoring program through
the best
sheep and
way
goats
we
underneath
have
the
right
USDA,
now is
most of those
to manage
flocks
is
end
to
up
cut our
having
losses.
a quarantine and then a mandated depopulation of those herds. And in doing that, they have absolutely drastically lowered the prevalence of scrapie in those species. So that's also kind of where some of the deer regulations are kind of based on and stuff of that nature that they've seen work in other areas. I do want to kind of back up and answer something for Lori. In the literature citing about felines being able to catch CWD, it has been shown, and it was said in the study, that there could be a good species barrier for it naturally passing. A lot of these studies are seeing if it's ever possible. So you're looking at intranasal, which is spraying something directly at the nose, or going directly intracranial, going right onto the brain, cutting the skull and putting the infected material right on there. So in studies that show that certain species can get it that way, it doesn't mean that they readily pick it up for the environment. And I think right now it is not believed that felines readily pick it up from the environment, but it has been shown that they could potentially be a species affected by it.
I'm glad you clarified that because a lot of these are lab studies, so they're not real life conditions, but they're testing to see the realm of possibility. But just because something is discovered in a lab does not mean that it's likely to happen naturally.
I'd like to add something back to the people that were thinking about having their meat tested and things like that, especially if they live in a CWD zone. One thing you have to remember is you cannot disinfect your tools. I keep two different sets of butchering tools now because I go with TWRA and we do active CWD testing, and I keep a set of knives in my kit for that. And then I keep a different set of knives for anything that I'm going to eat at the house. And anything that's tested, I know what it is. All the meat that comes into my freezer is tested now. But if you ever have one that's tested, dispose of your knives. You can't. It's next to impossible to disinfect them, even in laboratory
Robert, I've got a little
settings.
bit of a
They've had
question on that myself,
transmission
just
of
because you might be more
CJD
knowledgeable on it than I
through
am.
infected materials.
It
So,
seems like I'd read some
if
sort of
you're worried
literature that
about
was
that,
saying you
keep that in
potentially
mind. It's good to
disinfect
have
with
two
sodium
sets of knives.
hydroxide. Not that that's readily available for a lot of people, but I was just kind of curious about it on a scientific area, if you have heard that or if they'd mentioned that at all. That's true. That's a good point.
There's been a lot of things mentioned. The problem is doing it well enough, and it really, uh, yeah, it is possible to disinfect, but can you as a
Yeah, that's a good
layperson
point.
do
I
that
was just
well enough? I
curious
mean,
on
I could
that.
take everything and essentially incinerate it if I wanted to, but that's just not feasible for me as a person at the house. So, and I had a wildlife commissioner call me about disposing of CWD carcasses, and his suggestion to me was let's melt them in sulfuric acid and dispose of the acid.
Okay, folks, you have been wonderful. I just looked at the time. We are going on about an hour and a half. And I love these discussions because I think we learn as much as you do with some of the questions. They're fantastic questions. I'm going to click through my last couple of closing slides. Do want to credit Bob Howdeshell, but mostly those websites from the whitenosesyndrome.org and CWD Alliance. That's where I pulled most of the pictures for today's presentation. I do want to tell you, for my regulars here that attend these wildlife webinars, I'm taking a hiatus. It'll be about a month long. I'm going to be with Robert and a couple of other of the instructors. We are conducting our annual SWAP, the Student Wildlands Adventure Program. Robert's going to be bringing a crew of 16 folks from Tennessee. I've got about 5 or 6 folks from New Mexico. These are all young undergraduate Wildlife Society students, and we are going to take them walking in the footsteps of Aldo Leopold on the Gila and the Carson National Forest in New Mexico. It's going to be a 10-day marathon. We're going to be tied up with that for probably about three weeks straight. I'll be tied up 4 weeks straight. If you want to follow along with this year's event, make sure you like the Student Wildlands Adventure Program on Facebook, because we're going to be doing daily updates as we do that. But if you don't hear from us, we'll still be talking on the Facebook page. But the reason we're not doing any more classes for about a month is because of this student event. I do want to thank all the new folks that joined in tonight. We do these classes. Typically, we charge a small fee because we have to maintain a website and keep things running here. But if you want to sign up for wildlife classes, this is www.wildlifeforyou.com. Easiest thing to do, follow us on Facebook or Twitter. We're always posting links to upcoming classes. But again, we're going to have about a month-long hiatus from any of the next wildlife classes. But with that, I want to thank everyone for all your questions. They're fantastic. I will send an email out that has the recording of everything. And I want to thank you for being the very first class that experienced technical difficulty of the main instructor going down technically. But thankfully, Robert and Logan were here to carry the torch. So I appreciate everyone listening, and you guys were awesome. If you have any other questions, feel free to contact us through email or text or Facebook. We're always here to answer any wildlife questions you have. So thanks, guys.
Thanks for being here, guys. I appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody.